In this lecture, we'll be taking a closer look at the concept of multiculturalism, again, framing it in relation to the discipline of sociology. When we are looking at multiculturalism, we're looking at a lot of different ideas really bound up into a single term or concept. Multiculturalism can at times be a response to a more diverse kind of environment. Other times it can represent a range of meanings that relate to a wide range of ethnic and racial groups within a society. Multiculturalism can also be viewed through more of a competitive lens in the sense that when you have a more pluralistic society, you have a variety of cultures and cultural traditions that are commingling with one another rather, and competing with one another with regard to their position within a society and their voice within the larger, more dominant expression of that society. Now, if we look at culture through an anthropological lens, we realize that this is a psychological system that groups of individuals carry. It's a system that regulates behavior, the traditions, the expectations that you or I have in relation to spiritual or religious expression, or the roles that we may play or that are played as part of our interaction with others, the role of a mother or the role of a father. It may have something to do with our understanding of age, age relationships, age cohorts, how we perceive and understand expressive culture like art, how we perceive and understand the laws that govern a society, and how we internalize those laws as they relate to moral and ethical issues. So that's what culture is, and that's what a community of individuals who adhere to a cultural framework bring to a social setting. Multiculturalism, then, is when we get, as I said before, this kind of commingling of cultures and cultural traditions within a society-wide kind of context. And the term society now is where we bridge into sociology, those physical manifestations of community. It's a very large aggregate of individuals who have some sort of social, political or economic construct that confines them, circumscribes them, and defines them, in this case, ethnically. In this case, the idea of a nation state is an ethnicity, right? We conflate those two concepts in sociology, just like society, community, and ethnicity. So I guess looking at it through that lens for a moment, multiculturalism then would be these kinds of unseen, immeasurable psychological tendencies that aggregates of individuals have within a larger social and societal context. And that we have quite a bit of diversity of this, whether it's language-based, whether it's tradition-based, again, cultural in nature. Now, to understand this, we will turn strictly to our sociological discipline and look just through that lens at this notion of multiculturalism. We'll look at it as a process, we'll look at it as a social phenomenon, and we will also look at it as a reality with regard to Shirley Better's work and this idea of social change and the nature of society. So, in order to understand multiculturalism, we have to also look at it in terms of a hierarchy of scale. So we have things that are macro qualities and we have things that are micro qualities. A lot of what a sociologist will look at in relation to this notion of multiculturalism will focus more on the micro level. So micro-sociology, in a sense, is really focused on that face-to-face kind of interaction, not necessarily looking at community-wide kinds of trends, but how particular kinds of cultural traditions will express themselves within everyday social and linguistic interactions. So face-to-face relationships. So in sociological circles, this is where the idea of multiculturalism really is alive and at home. It's a kind of intimate, symbolic action that individuals take in relation to one another. The idea that we are reacting to a more culturally diverse environment, social environment that we might find ourselves within, and then how we are interacting within that multicultural expression is where the microsociology really starts to take shape, and where we start to see a lot of the different processes that are understood in terms of institutional trends, as are described by Shirley Better in her work. Now, what Better has done for us with regard to this notion of interaction and institutional racism, we realize that standardized perspectives, those that are considered to be stereotypical in nature, often these are also things that are exaggerated in nature. Uh, Often this will guide not only individual actions, but it will also be a big part of individual perspective. As you remember from Better's work, stereotyping is itself a process. This is a process of maintaining a standardized image or mental picture of a group or race to which all members of the group or race are said to conform. Statements, especially, and we see this in language, statements where you are really identifying otherness, and you're using that identification process to be able to create group membership as the individual discussing or describing a group of individuals. This is very much the process of stereotyping. And then individual racist actions will result in the subjugation, in this case of a person or a targeted group, or will enhance the privileges of a person or group that is either seeking out privilege or wanting to maintain privilege. And so that's, again, how Better is describing stereotyping as a process, and again, as a process that's maintaining a standardized image. Now, inside rather of a multicultural context, we have to ask ourselves, how does something like stereotype and stereotyping as a process, how does that function? Does it create diversity? Or does it emphasize diversity? Or does it accomplish what we see in terms of Better's primer? Does it, in a sense, maintain privilege for a particular individual or population who is incorporating stereotyping into how they are conceptualizing this kind of multicultural landscape within a society? Now, sociologists and sociolinguists provide some insight as well into this process, the idea that how we maintain space, residential patterns, housing patterns, things like that, how we incorporate meta-language into our communication process, or some of the semantics that we embed within our choice of language. So particular kinds of terms and ideas that are designed to transmit meaning and to accomplish this larger task. These are all things that a sociolinguist would say are a good part of this micro-sociology and this means of being able to measure how we are interacting with a multicultural environment, or how multiculturalism as a kind of process whereby individuals are negotiating a more diverse social environment, how that is manifesting itself and how it is, in a sense, being negotiated within a society. Deborah Tannen is a sociolinguist who provides pretty good insight into how this process occurs, and her research has historically focused on gender and communication. However, what you will find as we navigate through other parts of this lecture cycle that we will be taking a look at gender also through a racial lens. Um, but let's save that for a little bit later. In this case, Deborah Tannen, she is a professor of linguistics at Georgetown University, now professor emeritus. She has dedicated her research life to studying conversation, looking at issues of personality and identity, looking at gender, and of course, the idea or concept of power in American society and how language and language choice very much plays a big part of that power structure. Now, what you'll also find is that a lot of her work has focused on this notion of meta-language, or things that are not necessarily said or verbalized, but still communicate. So the idea of eye contact, facial expressions, body positioning, as I said before, how you negotiate personal space, how you might face an individual or what angle you might face an individual while you're speaking with them. All of these things are things that she's taking into consideration as she's looking at how people of different genders, in this case, and gender identities are interacting with one another. Her best known work, given this subject, is entitled You Just Don't Understand: Women and Men in Conversation, originally published in 1990. And in this work, and as I said, throughout much of her work, this is where we see her gender model, and it's a conversational model. And it's again applied to this notion of diverse language environments. Now, we can apply this idea and these ideas with regard to meta-language and communication in a more culturally diverse environment, and how individuals within a social setting such as the United States are interacting with one another. Of course, the scale will vary. You will have people who will be interacting at a very large scale, politicians, for example, on Sunday morning talk shows and editorial shows are going to be speaking at a scale that is much larger. That would be in the more kind of macro side of this kind of expression. And they would be very much the face of a racial ideology as they are talking about particular kinds of subjects having to do with inequality, race, and ethnicity. However, you can also look at this through that micro-social lens where when you communicate with an individual based upon your perceptions of that individual and your place within a social structure as it relates to that individual, whether it's social, economic, or political, how you negotiate that communication process. So one of the things that we can apply, and there will be a nice bridge between what you've been reading about and then of course the content of this lecture series, is this notion of background assumption. So in language, or in a sense language, can give us some sociological insight into how we understand cultural diversity and how we react to it. This notion of background assumption, these are ideas about, or the ideas that an individual has about a way of life or some assumptions that an individual may have regarding how things ought to be. And this is where, or how they ought to work. And this is where the notion, at least the anthropological notion of culture, starts to make itself known in the communication process. The idea that we have culturally rooted assumptions that we are bringing to the table, and that these assumptions are things that we will exude in our conversation and in our conduct. They're also assumptions that we will be acting on and reacting to with regard to others and how we perceive them. Harold Garfinkel in the 1960s wrote extensively on this idea of background assumptions. He's a sociologist who studied background assumptions and how they affect our view of others as these views relate also to ourselves. Now, Garfinkel examined the basic rules of social life, and when the basic rules of social life were being understood correctly and incorrectly on the part of individuals. And he was looking at a variety of contexts, but we're looking at this right now in terms of communication. So you have particular kinds of rules that govern your social life. I have rules that govern my social life. These are things that can be tied to the psychological phenomenon of culture, and then we are acting on those assumptions. And what we understand to be uh, your particular actions as they relate to me, and or even how you appear or how you, in a sense, what you represent, and then also all of that in your perspective or through your own perspective as it relates to me. So this is kind of that two-way process. And his work became part of a specialization referred to as ethnomethodology in sociolinguistic research. And it's a methodology that we can apply even outside of language. But again, making that connection between Dr. Garfinkel's work and this idea of ethnomethodology, the idea that you and I are participating in this process of understanding one another, and almost as if we are two ethnographers kind of conversing with one another, trying to understand each other's cultures and each other's assumptions regarding what's currently going on in the space that we occupy, or what's going on between us as we are communicating or behaving in a particular way in relation to one another. And this really strikes at the heart now of what multiculturalism is. So let's really try to get this into your notes in a very formal way. The concept of multiculturalism then is something I want you to conflate or blend with uh, this idea of pluralism, and that's something that you've now read extensively about. Pluralism is a philosophy that permits or encourages expressions of racial or ethnic diversity. It itself is a representation sociologically or socially of a more diverse, racially or ethnically diverse kind of social setting. And multiculturalism, or a more pluralistic society, is something that is also part of our modern history. By modern history, I mean it's really part of global trends in kind of or I should say, well, yeah, global trends of Western expansion, if you want to look at it that way, or colonialism. It would also be something that we would associate with neo-colonialism and the internal colonialism that occurs in modern societies. Um, it is also something that is post-colonial in nature. The idea that we are dealing with a a world that has been changed by this idea of exploration and culture contact and globalization as it relates to markets across the planet, tightening and interacting with one another on a much more intimate level. The idea that the distances that divide us have been shortened significantly in our modern history, or since really the 16th century. We've seen the lines that divide most rather language communities across the planet. The distances very much shorten over time. Now, people will look at that from two perspectives. They will look at that in a negative light, the idea that there's been this homogenization of culture over time. But I would say that generally we have to look at it in a similar way that even Better and her colleagues do in sociological circles, is that there's almost an inevitable quality to this idea of social and cultural interaction over time as we begin to have new technologies allowing us to communicate across greater distances or to travel across greater distances, we will come into contact with one another more readily, and we will impart our own ideas upon one another. Sometimes it's forced, unfortunately, and other times there is this kind of acculturation that can occur where people negotiate and choose to syncretize qualities of their traditions and their cultures with other individuals that they come into contact with. This can happen in terms of language, it can happen in terms of tradition, music, art, religion, you name it. But this is the essence of multiculturalism on its grandest scale, on a global stage. This idea of colonialism, post-colonialism, neo-colonialism, modernism, all of these kinds of isms coming together and becoming what we know the world to be today. And it continues to accelerate and develop over time as we have all of these kinds of new technologies regarding communication and linguistic interactions, and of course, economic interactions and travel as well. So, on a micro sense, then, as we start to experience multiculturalism and cultural pluralism on a global stage, this is also happening in our societies as well. And so we have to take a look as to what the impact that that more diverse social setting is having uh, on individuals. And there we get to the micro piece and how those individuals conduct themselves in these new social spaces and what kinds of expectations they may have in relation to one another. In this slide, we see a kind of schematic diagram, another kind of spectrum of sorts, for you to process through some of these historical pieces to the puzzle, and how people are reacting to culture contact on a global stage, but also how we internalize things kind of at that micro level. On the left-hand side of the image, you see the extreme negative, the idea that we reject multicultural trends and we act negatively against them. So you take a look at something like genocide, where we have a dominant group that tries to destroy or lay waste to what remains of another community, a cultural community that may exist within the confines of their social setting, or they may abut the border of their society or their nation state. And we've seen genocide persist throughout most of human history, and of course in our modern age we have seen it taken to an extreme level. You look at the Second World War, for example, and some of the ethnic cleansing that was occurring during the Second World War period, but then also what happened after that, or with the collapse of communism and some of the smaller ethnic states that were being kind of held in place by the communist regime in the Eastern Bloc environment or in the Eastern European environment, and how when that national social kind of government was removed, and these ethnic populations were able to nation state and or nation build rather in that kind of post colonial void. Some of the tragedies that occurred and genocide and this notion of ethnic cleansing was something that we saw quite a bit of as well. As we move towards something of in this kind of continuum or spectrum where we see greater acceptance, for example, we get to still negative kinds of rejectionist approaches, things like internal colonialism. This would be where we start to see populations, immigrants, for example, or immigrant populations that are being, in a sense, discriminated against. The two-tier labor system in the United States would be an example of internal colonialism as it relates to even a Marxist theoretical perspective of how individuals within certain social and ethnic groups that are identified again by race and ethnicity, how they are, in a sense, kept in lower paying environments or discriminated against in an employment or work setting in such a way as to maintain a lower income and not allow them to have the same scale of growth and personal economic growth as we would see with more dominant populations. So that would fit more into that kind of internal colonialism. And then as we move again to the right, we see things like segregation. You think of the impact of the Jim Crow law phenomenon in the South and how that persisted throughout not only the South, but of course the entirety of U.S. society, and how that maintained this kind of segregated environment. So we see that. We start to see then moving more toward acceptance things like assimilation. And again, assimilation has historically had a kind of a negative connotation to it. It's not always been a good thing, but the idea that one group will adapt to an environment, a new social environment, whether they are minority or a majority or somewhere in between, or some kind of blend of the two. The idea that I am part of a group and we are trying to make sense of this changing environment and we are trying to adapt to it, we are assimilating to it. That would be a little bit more on the kind of humanitarian side of this process of dealing with a multicultural, pluralistic society. And then, of course, we get to an ideal in the sense of acceptance and embracing and celebrating plurality within a society. And that's where we see multiculturalism as a political phenomenon developing or as a social reform that is adopted as an ideology by many political groups. We see that as being now something to really resolve some of the inequalities that and tensions that can develop out of a more diverse environment. So as you can see here, the dominant group encourages racial and ethnic variation. Ethnic variation is seen as a positive thing. It's looked at as something of a phenomenon to celebrate and to invest in socially. And then we no longer see the hegemony that goes along with being a more dominant population. So now dominance in this case can have some problems. Dominance, if it is strictly based or rooted in power, social, economic, or political, is something that is going to perpetuate advantage and privilege. However, dominance very often, and if we're looking at, let's say, immigrant diasporas as they relate to populations moving across the planet, could be numeric. The idea that we have a hostland society that is composed primarily of one ethnic group. We have a new ethnic group that is moving into that environment, is becoming their new homeland. The idea that dominance in this case is numeric, but the idea of a new population moving into the confines of a society is being celebrated by the more numerous population, and they're being welcomed and they're being given equal opportunities to contribute to that society. And another way of looking at this too is through the lens of something you have now studied more closely, which is this notion of an anti-racist praxis, the idea that a society will attempt to experience and understand otherness. They will attempt to, in some way, shape, or form, celebrate other diverse groups within, again, the confines of their social setting, and they will attempt to almost act as the ethnographer in a sense, or the research sociologist, uh, moving into that community conceptually, experiencing their food ways, their life ways, studying their language, celebrating their culture, and thereby better understanding them, and thereby really preventing any sort of inequality or isolationism to really grow in that um, divide between cultures. So again, the idea of multiculturalism, it can have political qualities to it, it can have social qualities to it, even economic qualities to it, but it's really all of that, and it is something that is part of our world today, and something that we as sociologists have to engage and understand, and something that has to be looked at in relation to this notion of inequality and discrimination, and whether or not the current context of how multiculturalism is experienced within a society, if that is allowing for um, or allowing to persist an unequal, discriminatory, institutionalized practice. Now, a really good working example for this idea or concept of a process of multiculturalism, and again, one that kind of connects to that spectrum we just looked at, is Ronald Takaki's 1993 article that looks at multiculturalism, whether or not it is something that is creating greater animosity within a society as we become more aware of ethnic diversity and racial diversity in that society, or is it something that is helping to develop greater meeting ground standards of, kind of an even playing field for all of our ideas to kind of commingle with one another and for us to better understand one another. And so what he's really doing in this article is really embodying Dr. Garfinkel's idea of background assumptions and how they are kind of competing with one another within this kind of social field of study and of experience. Now, when you take a look at Takaki's work, the thing that you realize is that he recognizes multiculturalism as an expression of pluralism. He also recognizes it to be a kind of philosophy that permits or encourages expressions of racial and ethnic diversity. And what I've done here in this PowerPoint image is I've also given you some page numbers if you have access to the article, to be able to go and specifically look at his writings and take away some of the main themes having to do with what he is bringing to the table in his research and in his research summary. So Takaki and others are, in this case, recognizing that there is a kind of culture war that has persisted over time, and the United States is, again, a very good example of a culture war environment. It is also a situation where he is recognizing quite a bit of diversity and diversification over time, and so it's a really good environment for him to be able to look at competing background assumptions between populations, between cultures. What he has done is he's really looked at university populations as an important area within American society where this kind of multicultural experience is happening and has historically happened. The university student body represents a very diverse social environment or community. The idea that we have students drawn from all over the world and all over the United States, students that come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different experiential backgrounds, different language traditions, of course, different racial and ethnic affiliations. Um, so the university environment really represents a good experimental um, community within which Takaki and other researchers can start to look at social interactions and multiculturalism. Now, Takaki also recognizes that there is a kind of cultural battle or cultural warfare that is occurring even within the institution of the university itself. The idea that we have these competing curricula, um, and that we are having an emphasis being given to a much more diverse curriculum, and how scholars and other academics are dealing with some of those messages and some of those ideologies as they're working their way into at least this kind of setting. So it's not only a great setting because of the student body, but it's also a great setting because the university as an institution is having to adapt very, very rapidly to a changing, more diverse social landscape. So he writes, many of the fiercest battles over how we define America are being waged within the academy. There, minority students and scholars are struggling to diversify the curriculum, while conservative pundits, and he gives some examples, are fighting to recapture the campus. So there's this kind of competition between those who kind of are hoping for the status quo to remain and those that are hoping to push that status quo to engage and embrace a much larger, more diverse population, both of students and of instructors as well. He writes, the stakes in this conflict are high, for we are being asked to define education and determine what an educated person should know about the world in general and America in particular. So, just a wonderful summary of what is going on. And this was written in 1993. So something that was going on, of course, in 1993 regarding post-secondary education, but also something that still continues to this day, because these same kinds of concerns that you're reading about and that you're thinking more deeply about are things that are still occurring in an educational system. And as I said before, and this is something that Ronald Takaki, I believe, would agree with, is that it is being hyper expressed in environments such as the American university. Now, this last piece that I read from Takaki's work also includes a summary of Alan Bloom's writings regarding this subject as well. Alan Bloom's um, work, The Closing of the American Mind, is something that Takaki highlights and talks a little bit more about in relation to his own thesis. Um, he writes, this is the issue Alan Bloom raises in his work, The Closing of the American Mind, a leader of the intellectual backlash against cultural diversity. He articulates conservative or a conservative view of the university curriculum. According to Bloom, he writes, entering students are uncivilized, and faculty have the responsibility to civilize them. So this is pretty potent kind of words that Bloom is using. As a teacher, he claims to know what their hungers are and what they can digest. And again, Bloom represents almost an elitist perspective regarding the student body and the role of the faculty in this case. What Takaki is arguing more for is a less active, a little more passive approach to be taken by the university and its faculty to embrace and to understand the student body as they come in the door, and then to challenge the student body in new ways of thinking. And those same new ways of thinking would connect with this subject of plurality and multiculturalism. So here, is the kind of two sides of the story. We have Takaki saying we need to embrace the plurality and we need to respect the many voices that make up our university system, whereas Bloom in this case is being portrayed as a little bit more of the kind of conservative or ultra conservative side of that particular argument, saying, no, 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 we have a specific responsibility here to profess knowledge, and the student body just has to listen. And so that's the kind of, again, give and take, almost culture war that occurs within the university system itself and how it's being administered. Good news, right? The arguments of Takaki are winning out in the end because they are arguments that embrace the student body and make students feel more welcome in the academic world. Yet they are also ideas of education, the idea of exposing students to new ideas, challenging students as they grow intellectually or continue to grow intellectually at that particular stage of life that they're in when they're entering that university system. So if you have a chance to take a look at, in this case, Takaki's writings, they're very, very powerful, and they're things that I really believe that you'll be able to relate to being a student in a university setting. Here I have highlighted a few other important concepts for you to look more closely at. On page 112 of his article, Takaki is looking at this idea of cross-cultural understanding, so specific kinds of coursework that promotes a cross-cultural perspective on the part of any student, no matter what his or her background might be in that college setting. So the idea of an open-minded curriculum and one that celebrates cultural diversity as opposed to kind of pushing back against that and seeking out some sort of status quo. And Takaki again challenges the reader by saying, well, how can we achieve this? Or are we achieving this based upon what is currently happening in these kinds of university environments? He also looks at language, the idea of a multilinguistic environment where we not only study culture and language, but we study culture and language in its most diverse way and actually incorporate a multilinguistic kind of curriculum into the workings of the university system. Then on page 114, he highlights this notion of comparison and multicultural scholarship. He highlights the ideas of Diane Ravitch, who challenges, again, students and scholars to really engage diverse skill sets, to expand and develop their talents, both intellectually and even physically, to be able to relate to individuals and others of more diverse backgrounds who have overcome a wide variety of, in this case, discriminatory forces or things that could be seen as barriers. How have individuals within a discipline, as they become exceptional examples of scholars within that discipline, have overcome things like poverty and discrimination, or any sort of obstacles that have attempted to prevent them from achieving their intellectual and physical goals. So again, wrapping this up in a pluralistic view of society and embracing, the totality of the society. And so that's really kind of the moral of the story here. And again, I challenge you to take a look at the entirety of Takaki's work. The idea that in our university settings, we have the opportunity on a micro level or a smaller scale level to be able to really resolve some of the imbalances that appear to exist within the surrounding society, to use the university and the university setting for both students, faculty, staff, and administrators to use that environment to be able to break down barriers, to create equality, and to have equality with this greater purpose, to drive all individuals, no matter what part of that university system you find yourself within, to achieve, to move forward, to be progressive in nature, and to be able to, in a sense, then take that achievement and apply the mechanics of that achievement to the surrounding society, which is itself by nature very pluralistic, but that again, unfortunately, has some of these structural issues that are preventing that kind of more celebrated multiculturalism that we saw on the previous slide, where we were looking at that spectrum of moving toward a more humanitarian, more accepted expression of pluralistic society.